The Penobscot Expedition was considered the worst naval defeat in American history up to the time of Pearl Harbor. We were very early on pro-revolutionary in Maine, and in the early part of the war, they moved into eastern Maine from Canada. They, of course, controlled the Maritimes. That was British territory. And they moved into eastern Maine and made Castine their chief headquarters, and actually built a large fort there to fortify their headquarters there. There was a lot of concern about this both in the lower part of Maine and in Massachusetts. So in 1779, a plan is created that is generally known in history as the Penobscot Expedition. And it is the idea of a naval expedition to bring forces up by sea rather than by land to literally challenge the British militarily in Castine and retake Castine, and then hopefully drive the British not only from Castine but also from all of eastern Maine back into British Canada. It proves to be a disaster. They literally rout the Massachusetts Navy, as it's called, under the leadership of Commodore Saltonstall, and a number of vessels are actually forced up the Penobscot River, which begins in the area of Rhona Island, Prospect, and Searsport, and even go up as far as modern-day Bangor and Brewer, and are ultimately scuttled there so that they won't fall into British hands. And in the case of the privateer Defense, which was one of the smaller vessels involved in the Massachusetts Navy, that was sunk or scuttled in Stockton Harbor. And it then, because of the nature of where it was sunk in fairly low water and in a very muddy area, it became today a wonderful archaeological site. And back in the 1970s, in the period of the American bicentennial, there was a big effort by the state of Maine, the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, and other groups to fund a major underwater archaeological excavation of the Defense. And then that collection has remained primarily at the State Museum since the 1970s and has periodically been put on display.
We'd like to welcome you to the main storage facility of the Maine State Museum, which is right through this door. I'll take you over to the racks where we store the artifacts from the Defense. When this vessel was discovered by some students from the Maine Maritime Academy in the 70s, we realized we had a very valuable archaeological site on our hands. So we formed a partnership with them and with some other folks and conducted an excavation over several years, recovering all this material. The Defense, after all, was a military vessel. She was actually a privateer, but she was equipped in a standard military manner. So she had cannon. Here are cannonballs. There was a lot of anti-personnel grape shot, these ball-bearing sized things that were sewn into bundles, which were then shoved down the cannon and they could be fired like a great big shotgun.
What was your reaction when you found out that all these items were preserved as well as they were?
Well, we had our hands full. We were thrilled because, of course, this was right during the bicentennial era. People were fascinated by the Revolutionary War and by this major naval disaster that the Revolutionary Navy suffered, Massachusetts Navy actually. This is a shot rack. So each of these balls would have been stored on a rack like that, ready for use. So the ship went down fully equipped. Now the thing that makes this collection remarkable is that the Defense was the one vessel that tried to make a run for it. And in the end, it realized it couldn't escape, and so the crew set it afire. And when the fire reached the powder magazine, it blew the bottom out, and it settled into the very muddy bottom of Stockton Harbor. That mud is kind of a gelatinous ooze. And as the ship settled in, everything there was covered with this mud, which had no oxygen in it, and it allowed wonderful preservation. We get a lot of evidence for how the crew ate, their foodways, as anthropologists call them. And it turns out that these folks still had sort of medieval style foodways. They ate in common. They had their food on a common trencher, and then they had their own individual bowls, and they would cook the food in common, and then retrieve their own pieces, share other things on the trencher, and all of this is preserved. The ceramics, of course, would probably preserve pretty well anyway, but the wooden trench is very rare. The wooden bowls are rare as well. You're looking at the largest artifact we recovered from the defense. It's the cauldron from the cook stove. It would have been filled with boiling water, and the cuts of meat that composed the sailors' meals would be tied to a string, lowered into the boiling water, and then retrieved with the string when they were cooked. Been somewhat damaged by probably being snagged by fishermen underwater before it was recovered archaeologically. We dove on the wreck recently, and the brick stove that surrounded this is still extant and visible on the bottom. So these are the tags that each individual sailor would tie to his allotted portion of meat, a joint of beef, which had been kept salted to preserve it. And he would have his assigned chunk, and he would tie a string to it, and to this tag he would drop the chunk into the cauldron and boil it until he was satisfied with it, and then he could retrieve it, and he knew it was his because his initials were on the tag tied to it. So we know that, you know, there were people with initials CW, AK, and other people used designs to identify their meat tag. We knew very little about life on board a ship of this sort, and when we found these tags, we realized that we had a mystery to solve. And these are not the only tags in the world, but we had to look long and hard to find one other instance where these similar tags had been found. I think it was in England. And when we found that, we realized that we had you know, really a direct tie to the sailors on that vessel. And if we could only find the ship's roster, we could tie those tags to individuals on that ship. Another example of wonderful preservation of these oak leaves, which may have been blowing around on deck or something when the ship went down, but they were nicely preserved. It's interesting to note that the men apparently were planning to spend a fair amount of time on the ship, and they left in a hurry, of course, so they left their shoes behind. But we also have fragments of leather indicating that they were making and or repairing their shoes during leisure time on the vessel. Here's another man's shoe. Shoes in this era are exceedingly rare. I mean, it's been in the mud, and it's been re-impregnated. The natural oils in the leather, of course, had gone, so it was re-impregnated with a water-soluble wax called polyethylene glycol, which makes it stable and even somewhat pliable. In terms of some other personal touches, we have here some silk, probably from a hair ribbon. Incredible that it's preserved all that time. And there's a knot in it, so I suspect that it was part of a hair ribbon. Men wore their hair long and often wore a ribbon in it. In terms of preservation, we have here actually a potato skin. That's how good the preservation was at this archaeological site. So they were meat and potatoes guy. We have a huge amount of beef bone, and we have potatoes. You know, archaeologists can read social information from artifacts. And that's what makes us become archaeologists. We look at an artifact, say for example this pin, which was part of a armament. So we look at that, and we don't ask only what it is. We ask, how did it get that way? Why was it on the vessel? What does it mean about the behavior of the people on the vessel? So the material objects are a way into the lives and the activities of the people who made and used the objects. So that's why archaeologists love what they do, because they are fascinated by the objects, but not for their own sake, not intrinsically, not as if they're works of art, but because they're social documents. I think these tankards are among our favorites. They were recovered in pieces and reassembled by the conservators, all made of wood. Interesting marks on the bottom. These no doubt would have been the owners. This is a broad arrow, perhaps made as a bit of a joke on the Royal Navy.
Explain that.
Well, because of course this was a colonial vessel, and I think the boys were probably having some fun carving the British broad arrow onto one of their tankards. What we plan to do now is to get the crew back together, and to finally publish a monograph on the excavation and on what has been learned from the excavation. Going forward in terms of future excavation, we're not entirely sure. There are certain sediment to raise the vessel and preserve it, but that is a huge undertaking, very costly, and then you'd have to find a home for it. Even if you bore all the costs of excavation and preservation, there are very few institutions that are likely to be willing to take care of it in perpetuity. So those are both the plans and the challenges for this ship and for this project in the future.